followers, don't tell anyone. And whenever I come across that in the Gospels, I always wonder if Jesus really expects people not to tell anyone. Don't tell. Well, blind Bartimaeus is healed. Don't open your eyes. Or a man lowered on a mat and he tells him, don't walk home. Or walking on water, or feeding 5,000 people. If I had seen somebody do something like that, I'd be talking about it. It'd be hard not to talk about it. Even without a miracle, I hope I'd be telling people about the love of God. But we come to this messianic secret, it's called by the scholars in our Gospels from time to time, and I think it's a pretty puzzling thing. In fact, the scholars don't really agree about what it means. They really have no good explanation, so we kind of have to leave it there. But one of the things I wonder about that is maybe Jesus wanted some time to himself. Maybe he just wanted to get a rest out of the public eye for a moment, because it must have been really tiresome, I would think, exhausting, to be followed around by demanding crowds all the time. So we have Jesus healing this deaf man and telling the disciples, the followers, not to tell anyone. And of course, they shouted from the hilltops. Of course they do. They couldn't keep quiet. This man whose ears were opened and his tongue released, his life is entirely transformed. And he shouts it from the mountaintops. We have this very simple command from Jesus, be open, simple words of healing. Be opened. And I think that is a healing word for all of us. If we open our ears, we're listening. And couldn't our world use a lot more listening, especially now, I think. If we are open to others, we have a healthy curiosity or interest in that other person. If we are open to others, we're about understanding the other. We're about knowing how much we need each other. And in fact, if we're truly open, we're willing to be converted. We are willing to be changed by the other that stands before us. So openness is not just for our ears, it's for our heart and mind. And don't we struggle with that, I think, especially today. Imagine in the politically divided world that we live in right now, if we weren't on sides that were not open to each other, if we were open to each other, if we were listening to each other, imagine the difference it would make. We would have a curiosity about how the other side thinks. Maybe we wouldn't even think in terms of sides. We'd be trying to understand each other. And we'd realize that we need each other. We need each other. We need those people who think entirely different than we do. And we'd be willing to be converted. Sometimes it's hard to even imagine. But I know I have a visceral response to that. But if we could just say to our politicians and political leaders, Ephatha, be opened. If they could open their ears, if we could open our ears and truly listen to the other and understand each other and be willing to be converted and get rid of our filters and biases and preconceived ideas. And certainly there is an element of spirituality when it comes to being open. Openness is a spiritual gift that heals us, that makes us whole and holy. When we're spiritually open, we're aware of different possibilities. Somebody who thinks differently than we do. And certainly I suppose that includes God. Being open to being converted to that image of God that is within each one of us. When we're open, the possibilities are just endless. There is always more of God to know, always more of God to receive. And so being open makes that possible. I think then once we are open, we realize that requires some responsibility too. You know, there's danger and opportunity in being open to each other. Because really, what if I was converted to the other side? I can't even imagine. And when that deaf man hears, he takes on that opportunity and that danger. He had never heard the lullabies of his mother's song. He had also never heard a passing insult. And now he might hear a cry for help and have to make a choice about that. Now he is able to communicate, and there are new relationships for him and his relationship to the world. Being open is a transformative experience, very powerful experience. When we're open, we can receive the truth. We can be open and aware of a whole new level of being in relationship with others and with God. There is always more of God, always more of God to be open to receive and to take in. We can accept the fullness of God's presence. And when we do that, we also accept the cross and the grave and the resurrection. So this truth, this openness can be risky business. Sometimes it's easier to be closed and to remain ignorant because we fear the pain, and that might lead us to be closed, to reject the fullness of God. Sometimes we're afraid. We've opened ourselves to love and perhaps been rejected. Or sometimes we're tired because we've opened ourselves to compassion and it has meant a lot of work. Sometimes it's so hard to be patient and to listen, just to be open and to hear and to be in full relationship with each other and with God. And this openness, of course, is a choice. This is something that we choose in every moment. And we see this in these two short gospel stories that we have today. One following the other, the first one really demonstrating what happens in the second one. Because when we read that story of the Gentile woman, what we see is Jesus not being open. What does he say to this woman, this Gentile woman? Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Jesus was not open to her. In fact, at that moment, I think he was a deaf man and had an impediment in his speech. So this is Jesus, fully human, in the fullness of his humanity, not open to this woman in that moment. But then, of course, he realizes immediately when she responds to him, he realizes immediately that he wasn't open. And he became open to her, and her daughter is healed. And Jesus himself is immediately transformed. So he goes to heal the deaf man. Jesus teaches what he has learned. Ephphatha, be opened. Those are healing words for every one of us. And as it was for Jesus, it begins with knowing ourselves. That Gentile woman had a mirror that she held up for Jesus. And Jesus saw himself. He saw himself clearly. And he changed. So when we see ourselves, we can recognize who we are in the presence of God. We can see ourselves and perhaps begin to be healed and transcend. to see ourselves knowing that that God, that image of God is within us and imminent, as close as can be. So knowing ourselves means we know both of those things, how we fall short as well as how close we are to God. And when we know ourselves, we can know each other more deeply. Because we find out, you know what? The way I'm feeling is just the same way as my neighbor feels. And maybe it's different, but we're all coming from the same place because we're in this all together. We have the same fears and insecurities. They manifest themselves differently. But we're really all the same as we stand before God, both worthy and unworthy of that love. So knowing ourselves, knowing others, and then knowing God in the midst of that. Being open and receptive. Listening to the Spirit of God and how it speaks to each one of us. And depending on each other for that collective wisdom that we share as people in this world. And of course, with that comes the responsibility. Because, as it says in our epistle, our faith without works is dead. And when we get to that place of faith, what we find is that our true faith is compelling us to act, to be in this world as images of God. A lively faith is compelling. It's something that we can't ignore. It's right there in front of us all the time, this faith that is alive and well, and today calling us to be open. To be open to creativity, to new possibilities, to be open to communication, to having good reception, to listening, even when we're not willing or not paying attention, to be aware of God at work around us, to get rid of the interference that keeps us from hearing, to be spiritually open, not spiritually deaf or blind or lame. It's choice that every one of us makes. And you know, I think we have to work at it all the time. And when you have your sight or your vision or your hearing or something taken away from you, I think that's when we should be working the hardest, be the most determined to see and to hear. I don't know if you all know, but my father has been blind for most of his life. And I grew up watching him determined to see in every way that he could see. He would do all these creative things to make his lack of vision work for him. He was an engineer, so that was pretty. He could see, he was legally blind. He could see a little bit, but it was pretty tough. But he had amazing courage. I thought I was always inspired. He used his other senses. I remember one time calling my mother. They lived in Boston, and the vacuum was running in the background, and I knew she wasn't vacuuming. And I said, well, who's vacuuming? I wish she would just quit doing that. He's vacuuming. So the blind man was up there vacuuming. But he was an engineer, so, you know, he had the room measured out. He made sure that he got every inch of the room. And another thing he did was he rode his bike to work every day. Yeah, I don't really know how he did it, but he did. He had accidents occasionally, but but it was just kind of amazing to see him determined to see when he had no vision. And I think we can all be that way, especially spiritually, determined to hear and to listen. It's an attitude of mind and heart. It certainly was with my father. To be open. Ephatha. To have that determination and courage and belief and creativity to use all of ourselves to listen to God and to each other. You know, we really should be practicing more listening prayer than talking prayer. To wait as God speaks to us, and then to be compelled by our lively faith to manifest that listening and hearing and doing in the world. That is God's promise to us, abundance, the pouring out of the Spirit, so much more than we can possibly take in. So be open and receive the presence of God. Be healed as God desires it for you. And this is what it means to be whole, to be holy. As you are transformed, shout it from the mountaintops, because there is no secret here. Amen.